The phone call came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Garrett Oakes almost didn't answer it. He was in the middle of making his daughter's lunch, peanut butter on whole wheat, the crusts cut off because Lily still hated crusts even at age 9, when the number showed up on the counter screen. No name, area code 403. He figured it was another bank, another automated voice about refinancing options he couldn't afford to consider. But something made him pick up anyway, maybe just to have a voice in the kitchen other than the radio. "Is this Oakes Heritage Timber?" a woman said. "Not a machine, an actual person," which surprised him. "It is," he said, and tucked the phone between his ear and his shoulder so he could keep cutting. "I'm calling from Meridian Development Group. My name is Sylvie Beauchamp. I'm the Chief Operating Officer." She paused the way people do when they expect the title to land. "We have some equipment we need removed from a site in Cochrane. Apparently your name came up as someone who accepts salvage." Garrett set down the knife. "What kind of equipment?" "Old milling machinery, blades, frames, sorting tables. From a decommissioned sawmill operation. We're breaking ground in 3 weeks and the county won't let us proceed until the site is cleared." Another pause, shorter this time. "We're not looking to sell it. We just need it gone. You can have it for the cost of hauling it yourself." He asked a few questions. She answered them in the clipped way of someone who had already moved on mentally to the next item on her agenda. The machinery had been sitting in a covered shed since the mid-90s. Some of it might be operational, she said, and the way she said it made clear she didn't think much of its prospects either way. Garrett wrote down the address on the back of a grocery receipt. He said he'd think about it. He did not, in fact, think about it for very long. Sylvie Beauchamp had been awake since 5. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that she'd spent the first 40 minutes of the morning sitting at her kitchen table in Calgary without opening her laptop, which she hadn't done on a weekday since her son Hugo was born 5 years ago. She just sat there with her coffee going cold and looked at the window and the gray October sky behind it. The Cochrane project was the largest in Meridian's western portfolio. 42 townhomes, a commercial strip, a stormwater management feature that the planning documents called a naturalized pond and that Sylvie privately called a glorified ditch. It was going to take 3 years and it was going to make a lot of people a lot of money, herself included. She had fought for this file. She had restructured timelines and renegotiated supplier contracts and sat through 17 hours of public consultation meetings where she smiled at people who called her project an abomination to their community's character. The sawmill site was the last loose end. 40 years of accumulated iron and steel and rotting wooden frames, all of it sitting in a shed the size of a gymnasium on the north end of the property. The Heritage Review had cleared it. No designation, no protection order, nothing to stop them. The machinery was junk. The only question was who would take it. When her assistant had mentioned someone named Oakes out of a town called Didsbury, Sylvie had said fine, get his number. She hadn't thought about it again until she made the call herself that morning because her assistant was off sick and the timeline didn't move for sick days. She didn't ask much about him. She had a project to run. Garrett drove out to Cochrane on a Saturday with his brother-in-law Derek and a borrowed flatbed. Lily was at her grandmother's for the weekend, his mother-in-law Patrice, who lived 30 minutes south and who made a point of taking Lily every second Saturday so that Garrett could, as she put it, breathe. He appreciated it more than he ever said out loud. The weekends without Lily were quieter in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable, and he usually filled them with work. The site was easy enough to find, a gravel access road off the highway with a faded sign that still said Hartwell Lumber in ghost lettering. A property manager named Kowalski met them at the gate and walked them through the shed without saying much, which suited both men fine. Derek let out a low whistle when the lights came on. The machinery was old. That much had been obvious from the call. But old wasn't the same as ruined, and Garrett had known that before he drove 2 hours to find out for sure. There were 3 large frame saws in various states of assembly, a sorting and grading table that looked nearly intact, a set of edger blades still in their original wooden cradles, and in the far corner, covered in a canvas that had calcified into something approaching concrete, what turned out to be a fully intact gang saw from what Garrett estimated was the late 1950s. He stood in front of that gang saw for a long time. Derek came up beside him. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "I'm thinking we're going to need 2 more trips," Garrett said. They loaded what they could that day and drove back to Didsbury in the early dark. "Derek, talking about hockey, and Garrett, mostly listening. The shop was dark when they pulled in, a converted equipment building on the edge of town, rented by the month, with his name on a sign above the door that his daughter had helped him paint. Oaks Heritage Timber. She'd insisted on the ampersand in the logo, even though it was just him. He didn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about the gang saw. Sylvie got the confirmation email from Kowalski the following Monday. Site cleared, machinery removed, ready for assessment. She forwarded it to her project lead without reading it fully, and moved on. The Cochrane project consumed November. There were foundation engineering revisions, and a dispute with the framing contractor, and a community liaison meeting that ran 3 hours over its scheduled end because a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Aldous had questions about drainage that turned out to be quite reasonable and took time to answer properly. Sylvie drove home from that one at 11:30 and sat in her car in the parkade for a few minutes before going upstairs. Hugo was asleep. Her ex-husband Claude, who had Hugo every other week, had dropped him off that afternoon. There was a drawing on the kitchen counter, a house with a very large son and a dog, even though they didn't have a dog. Hugo wanted a dog badly. Sylvie kept saying they'd talk about it. She made tea and stood by the window and looked at the city lights and tried to remember the last time she'd felt genuinely excited about something. She went to bed before midnight, which was early for her, set her alarm for 5. The first call from the collector came in January. Garrett almost missed it again. He was under the edger table with a flashlight and his phone was across the shop, but he scrambled up in time and answered it without knowing who it was. The man introduced himself as Raymond Gould. He was calling from a museum society in Vancouver. He'd heard through someone who'd heard through someone else that Garrett had acquired some milling equipment out of a site near Cochrane, and he was specifically interested in anything pre-1960. Gang saws in particular. Garrett sat down on an overturned crate. He'd spent the past 2 months cleaning and cataloging everything from the Heartfelt site, working most evenings after Lily went to bed. He'd taken the canvas off the gang saw and found it in remarkable condition, not operational, not without significant work, but structurally sound and complete, which was almost unheard of for equipment that age. He'd posted some photos in a couple of online forums, mostly to get a sense of what he was dealing with. He had not expected Raymond Gould. He had not expected Raymond Gould to mention almost casually that a complete gang saw of that era and in that condition could fetch somewhere between $60,000 and $120,000 at the right auction. Garrett said he'd need some time to think. He called his mother-in-law Patrice that night. She listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode. "You need to talk to someone who knows about this," she said. "A proper appraiser." "I know. Before you agree to anything, I know Patrice." Garrett. Her voice changed. "This is real, isn't it?" "Yeah," he said. "I think it might be." Sylvie found out about it in February, and not in a way she would have preferred. She was in a meeting with Meridian's board when one of the directors, a man named Holt who collected antique furniture and liked people to know it, made a passing comment about a heritage machinery auction he'd seen listed online. Complete Hartwell lumber gang saw, 1958, exceptional provenance. Sylvie didn't react visibly. She had spent a decade learning not to react visibly, but when the meeting ended she went directly to her office, closed the door, and pulled up the listing on her screen. The estimated auction value was listed as $80,000 to $120,000. The provenance description included a direct reference to the Hartwell lumber site in Cochrane, Alberta, Meridian's site, which meant the equipment had come from her project. The equipment she had given away. The equipment that had been, in the formal language of her directive to Kowalski, available for salvage at no cost to the acquiring party. She read the listing 3 times. Then she called Kowalski. The conversation was short and not particularly useful. Kowalski confirmed that yes, the machinery had been picked up by a salvage operator, yes, it had all been documented, yes, there was a signed release form, and yes, the release was legally binding. Sylvie hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then she called legal. She drove to Didsbury herself. That was not standard practice. She had staff for site visits and vendor meetings and any number of things that required leaving the office. But she told herself it was more efficient to handle it directly, and she believed this enough to make it feel true. She found the shop without much trouble. The sign was hand-painted, Oaks Heritage Timber, with a small ampersand that looked like a child had added it, which she found either charming or irritating and couldn't decide which. The bay doors were open and a country radio station was playing something she didn't recognize. The man who came to meet her was taller than she'd expected, or maybe that was the shop, making everything feel proportionate. He wiped his hands on a rag before offering to shake hers, which she appreciated. He looked tired in the way that people with young children often look, not depleted, just operating on a permanent mild deficit. "Mrs. Beauchamp," he said, not a question, "Mr. Oakes." She looked around at the equipment along the walls, cleaned, organized, some of it tagged with handwritten labels. She recognized the edger frames and the sorting table. The gang saw was against the far wall, and even she could tell, not knowing anything about it, that it was something different from the rest. She kept her eyes on the middle distance. "I think there may have been a miscommunication about the nature of the salvage arrangement." Garrett looked at her. "The equipment was offered for removal," she continued. "We may not have been sufficiently clear that the intent was disposal, not commercial resale or auction." She had rehearsed this. It sounded reasonable in the car. It sounded somewhat less reasonable out loud in a working shop with sawdust on the floor. "You gave it to me," Garrett said. He wasn't aggressive about it. He just said it the same way he might say the sky was gray, which it was that day. "There may be questions around the terms of the release. Your legal team sent me the release form. I signed it. Your property manager countersigned it. It's dated November 4th. He paused. "I have the original." Sylvie said nothing. "Ms. Beauchamp." He was careful with her name, she noticed. Not unkind. "I have a 9-year-old daughter. I run this shop by myself. For the last 2 months I've been doing the work of cleaning and cataloging and researching this equipment on evenings and weekends because that's the only time I have." He looked at the gang saw. "I didn't go looking for this. You called me." It was the last sentence that she felt. Not as an accusation, he didn't deliver it that way, but as a fact that landed somewhere specific the way certain facts do. She looked at the gang saw again. She looked at the labels on the frames. She looked at the ampersand on the sign above the door. She left without making any demands. She drove back toward Calgary in the thin February light, and she didn't turn the radio on. The auction was held in April, in Edmonton. Garrett drove up the night before with Derek and stayed at a motel that smelled like chlorine from the pool on the ground floor. They went for dinner at a place they picked at random, and Derek ordered the ribs and spent most of the meal telling Garrett he needed to relax, which was not useful advice but was offered sincerely. He called to check in on Lily, who was with Patrice for the weekend. "How's my peanut?" he said. "Daddy, I'm 9, Lily said. "Almost 9.5. Almost 9.5. "How's almost 9.5? "Grandma let me stay up until 9:30, she reported. "Don't tell her I told you. That's a lot of 9.5s, Garrett said. She laughed and told him she loved him and told him to bring her back something. And he said he'd try, and he hung up and sat on the edge of the motel bed and looked at his boots for a while. He thought about his wife. He did that sometimes, less often than in the first 2 years, but still, he'd think about what she would have said. Claire had been the one with the business sense between the two of them. She'd have had a spreadsheet. She'd have talked to 3 lawyers and read every piece of case law she could find, and she'd have made him read a summary of it before I signed anything. He thought she'd have liked the gang saw. She'd like things with history. The gang saw sold for $114,000. The rest of the equipment, the edger blades, the grading table, 2 of the frame saws, sold across 2 separate lots and brought in another $43,000 combined. Garrett stood at the back of the room while the numbers went up and tried to keep his face normal. Derek was not trying to keep his face normal. At one point, a woman next to him asked if he was all right, and he said he was fine. He was just allergic to good news. Garrett called Patrice from the parking lot. She cried, which he had not expected and which made him cry a little, which he would not have predicted for himself standing in a parking lot in Edmonton on Thursday afternoon. But there it was. He drove home the next morning alone. Derek had taken the truck back the night before, and he stopped at a gas station outside of Red Deer and bought Lily a keychain with a tiny Mountie on it, because it was the only thing in the gift section that wasn't a magnet. She loved it. She put it on her backpack immediately and declared that the Mountie's name was Gerald and that he protected her pencil case. "Perfect," Garrett said. "Every pencil case needs a Gerald." The letter arrived 3 weeks after the auction. It was from Meridian's legal team, and it was addressed to Garrett personally. which meant someone had made an effort to get his home address, which he noticed. The letter ran to 4 pages and used a great deal of language about material misrepresentation and unjust enrichment and the nature of salvage agreements under Alberta property law. He read it twice. He called his own lawyer, a woman named Shaughnessy, who had handled his lease agreement and a boundary dispute with his landlord 3 years prior. She called him back that afternoon. "They're testing the water," Shaughnessy said. "The release is clean. They'd know that before sending the letter, so what do they want? Probably a settlement, something. Anything that lets them say they recovered some portion." She paused. "It's embarrassing for them, Garrett. Somebody gave away $150,000 of recoverable assets that somebody is probably being asked to explain themselves right now." He thought about Sylvie Beauchamp standing in his shop in February, looking at the gang saw with an expression he hadn't quite been able to read. "I don't think I'm going to settle," he said. "Okay," Shaughnessy said. "That's your right. The position is solid. Can I ask you something?" "Sure, if I made a gesture, something goodwill type. Would that create any kind of legal problem?" She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of gesture?" Sylvie got the package on a Wednesday. She almost didn't open it herself. Parcels that came to her office usually went through her assistant first, but it had been sent to her attention with a handwritten note on the outside that said, simply, "For Sylvie Beauchamp, personal." And something about the handwriting made her pick it up. Inside was a framed photograph, a black and white image of the Hartwell sawmill in what the attached card identified as 1961. The mill in full operation, a crew of a dozen men standing in front of the gang saw, all of them looking at the camera with the particular expression of people who have just been told to look at the camera. On the back of the photograph, in pencil, someone had written names, all 12 names in careful, small handwriting. The card from Garrett read, "Found this with the equipment, thought it should belong to someone who knows where it came from." The men in the photograph built something that lasted 60 years, figured that was worth noting. Oak Sylvie set the photograph on her desk and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the meeting where Holt had made his passing comment. She thought about the 4-page letter she'd authorized, which had achieved nothing, except costing her firm $700 in billable hours. She thought about the drive back from Didsbury in February, the flat gray fields on either side of the highway, the way she hadn't turned the radio on. She picked up her phone. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Mr. Oakes, Ms. Beauchamp." A pause. Neither of them seemed to be in a hurry to fill it. "The photograph is remarkable," she said. "Thank you." It seemed like the right home for it. She looked at the 12 men in the photograph, at the gang saw behind them, recognizable even in that old image, even before 60 years of dust, at the names on the back in someone's careful handwriting, names she didn't know, men she'd never heard of, who had operated a mill in a field that was now going to be 42 townhomes. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For February." He was quiet for a moment. "You were doing your job. I was trying to undo a mistake by making it someone else's problem." She said it plainly, the way she'd been working towards saying it for weeks without quite getting there. "That wasn't fair to you." Another pause. "My daughter named the Mountie keychain Gerald," Garrett said. Sylvie blinked. "I'm sorry? It's been a good spring. That's all I was going to say." She found herself almost smiling, which was not what she'd expected from this phone call. "I'm glad, Ms. Beauchamp." His voice was careful but not cold. "You can drop the letter. I was never going to make it difficult. I just needed to know it was going to stay mine." She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I'll have legal send a withdrawal notice." "Okay, take care of yourself, Mr. Oakes, you too." She hung up and looked at the photograph again. 12 men in a machine that someone had decided was junk, right up until the moment someone else decided it wasn't. The shop expanded in the fall. Not dramatically. Garrett rented the adjacent unit from his landlord and knocked a doorway through the shared wall, which took him and Derek a full weekend and cost him 2 scraped knuckles and 1 heated disagreement about whether to use the reciprocating saw or the oscillating tool. An argument whose details he would be unable to recall 6 months later, but whose outcome Derek would continue to reference as a personal victory. He hired someone part-time. A retired millwright named Hector from Olds, who knew more about vintage timber equipment than Garrett had learned in 3 years of self-teaching, and who required a very specific type of coffee and a radio station that played classic country exclusively, 2 conditions Garrett found entirely reasonable. Lily came to the shop on Saturdays now when she didn't have soccer. She had taken it upon herself to organize the label system, which she managed with an earnestness that he found both useful and slightly humbling. She used color-coded stickers and a spiral notebook and had opinions about archival consistency that were, Hector told her seriously, extremely professional. "Dad," she said one Saturday afternoon, looking up from a parts tray she'd been cataloging, "is this going to be our thing? Like our actual thing?" Garrett was at the workbench. He looked over at her. "What do you mean?" "Like other dads have, like a garage, or fishing. But ours is this." She gestured at the shop, the organized shelves, the pieces of machines in various states of resurrection. "Is this ours?" He thought about that. He thought about a phone call on a Tuesday morning and a flatbed borrowed from a cousin-in-law. He thought about the gang saw under its calcified canvas. He thought about an auction room in Edmonton and a parking lot and Patrice crying and Lily's Mountie on her backpack. "Yeah, Peanut," he said. "This is ours." She nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already worked out, and went back to her stickers. Sylvie Beauchamp closed the Cochrane project in the spring of the following year. The townhomes went up on schedule, which was not common and which she took a certain quiet satisfaction in. The commercial strip leased 60% of its units before construction was complete. The stormwater feature, which she had privately called a glorified ditch for 2 years, was written up in a regional planning magazine as an example of thoughtful naturalization design, which she found genuinely funny. She got a dog, a medium-sized one of no determinable breed that Hugo had picked from the shelter by the straightforward method of sitting on the floor and waiting to see which dog came and sat next to him. The dog's name was officially Biscuit, which was Hugo's choice, and which Sylvie had agreed to because the expression on her son's face when he said it made other considerations irrelevant. She still started work at 5 most mornings. That hadn't changed, but she'd been finding, lately, that the coffee was worth sitting with for a few extra minutes before opening the laptop. Just to watch the light change over the city. Just to hear Hugo breathing through the baby monitor she still kept on the counter even though he was 5 and didn't need it anymore. The Hartwell photograph hung in her home office. She'd had it reframed, proper archival glass, a mount that protected the paper, and she'd looked up 2 of the 12 names before she stopped herself, not because the research wasn't interesting, but because there was something about not knowing that felt right. These were men who had gone to work and done their jobs and built something that had, without any of them planning it, outlasted everything they thought they were building it for. She figured that was worth something. She wasn't entirely sure what, yet, but she kept the photograph on the wall where she could see it from her desk, and she thought about it more often than she would have predicted. Some things, it turned out, held their value even after everyone agreed they were done.